With hindsight, Craig's Rolfe descent into a life of crime seems almost inevitable. After all, his first view of the world was the grey walls of Holloway Prison. His mother, Lorraine, was serving 18 months after lying to the police in a bid to protect her teenage lover. That lover had ruthlessly beaten her husband, Rolfe's dad, with a skittle until his skull was crushed like an eggshell. Tony Tucker was later to tell his gang members the sad story of Rolfe's birth had left him with a chip on his shoulder. Lorraine of Basildon had been seeing 19-year-old John Kennedy while her husband Brian worked as a market trader. On Christmas Eve, 1968, the youngster crept into their home, and as 28-year-old Brian lay asleep next to Lorraine, he killed him. When she was woken by the noise, Kennedy allegedly told her, "I have done it to prove how much I love you." Kennedy, also of Basildon, and 23-year-old Lorraine were both arrested and charged with murder. Lorraine, who was already a mother of three and expecting Rolfe, told the police, "I never touched him, honest, on my baby's life." She was cleared of the murder charge, but sobbed as the judge sentenced Kennedy to life. Then, as he gave her 18 months for making false statements, Mr. Justice Bridge told her, "I accept as the basis of my sentence that you were confirmed with a dilemma when you realised your lover had murdered your husband. But I cannot escape from the conclusion that it was an event which caused satisfaction rather than distress, and you were prepared to do what lay in your power to see your lover escape punishment." Lorraine cried, "I'd done nothing," as she was led from Sussex Court, supported by prison officers. She later said, "I was 3 months pregnant with Craig when his dad was murdered. My family has been dogged with bad luck." Rolfe, a cocaine addict, became a gopher for Tony Tucker when he joined his gang in the early 1990s. He was probably his most trusted friend, and associates say he was quite possessive of Tucker. He was certainly implicated in some of the gang leaders' most dubious scams. In September 1995, they were approached by a part-time drug dealer who had £18,000 worth of cannabis to sell. Tucker and Rolfe took the man to Birmingham, where Tucker claimed to have a contact. When the dealer and Rolfe waited, Tucker disappeared with the drugs. He returned saying police had busted them before he got the money. The dealer either had to accept the excuse or take them on. There is no police record of a bust in the city at that time. Rolfe lived with his longtime girlfriend in Chatham Hundred. He also owned a property in Mill Green, Basildon. Rolfe had a young daughter at the time of his death. An article about the trial appeared in the Southend Standard on the 20th of March 1969 with the headline, "Murder Trial for Lovers." A wife and her lover murdered the woman's husband and disposed of the body to make it look like he had been waylaid and robbed on the highway, the prosecution alleged at the Sussex Court on Monday. Mr. Marvin Everett, QC, prosecuting, told the jury that they did this so the two accused at the same time could rid of the unwanted husband and acquire his money. Mrs. Lorraine Rolfe, 23, of Linford Drive, Basildon, and John Kennedy, 19, also of Basildon, pleaded not guilty to the joint charge of murdering Mrs. Rolfe's husband, Brian, a 28-year-old market trader whose body was found in his parked van in a lay-by on the Stanford bypass at Corringham on Christmas Eve. Mrs. Rolfe also pleads not guilty to making false statements to the police with the intent to impede the apprehension of Kennedy. Kennedy pleads guilty to breaking and entering Mr. Rolfe's home on December 23rd and stealing £597 belonging to Mr. Rolfe. Mr. Everett said it would appear Mr. Rolfe was struck on the head with a 10-pin bowling alley skittle weighing 3.5 pounds. The death occurred in the small hours of the 24th of December 1968 in Mr. Rolfe's home. Mr. Everett alleged Kennedy hit Mr. Rolfe with the skittle, killing him. It is and will be the submission of the prosecution that these two accused had planned the death of Brian William Rolfe that night and to dispose of his body in a way that it would make it look like he's been waylaid on the public highway, assaulted and robbed so that the two accused at the time could get rid of the unwanted husband and acquire his money. Mr. Everett said that Mr. Rolfe, a hard-working man, left home in his van 6:15 every morning and would not return home until the late in the evening. Mr. and Mrs. Rolfe had 3 children aged 7, 6 and 2, Mr. Everett added. Mrs. Rolfe is and was at the marital time again pregnant. Mr. Everett said Kennedy and Mrs. Rolfe were lovers and told the jury that Mr. and Mrs. Rolfe's marriage had not always been an easy or normal one. At Christmas 1967, Mrs. Rolfe and Kennedy went off together to Birmingham, but this only lasted a few weeks, and it appeared that Mrs. Rolfe returned to her husband. You may think that on all probabilities Mr. Rolfe thought that the affair between his wife and Kennedy was over, but it wasn't, as in due course you will hear. Mr. Everett also said there had been trouble between Mr. Rolfe and Kennedy, and at some time last November it had erupted into violence. It appeared there was a fight, and Kennedy struck or attempted to strike Mr. Rolfe over the head with a bottle. The police were told, but no action was taken, as it was thought the incident was a domestic affair. Mr. Everett said it appeared that Mr. Rolfe was away during the day visiting markets in Kent. Kennedy spent a great deal of his time at Linford Drive. And again, you will probably come to the conclusion that there was no doubt that the affair continued, and Kennedy and Mrs. Rolfe remained lovers. Mr. Everett said that on December the 3rd, Kennedy, Mrs. Rolfe, and one of the children went to London and bought Christmas presents at Selfridges. When asked by a friend what her husband was going to say about all the presents, Mrs. Rolfe was alleged to have replied, "John reckons Brian won't be there." Mr. Everett said that Mrs. Rolfe also asked, "What would I do if I found a body on the floor in the house?" Mr. Everett read 2 statements said to have been made by Mrs. Rolfe. In the first, she said that her and her husband had not always gotten well together, and he left her for about a month, about 2 years ago. When her husband found out that she and Kennedy were seeing each other, Mr. Rolfe went mad and beat her up and assaulted Kennedy afterwards. She and her husband made things up. The statement added that she was also pregnant by her husband. The second statement she alleged to have made said that in the middle of the night, she had a thump and woke up to see Kennedy standing beside her bed. He shouted at her to get out of bed. I shot out of bed and picked the baby up, and Brian was making terrible noises, and I went downstairs and into the front room. I guessed what had happened, but I couldn't go back upstairs, and I haven't been up since. When Kennedy returned, he told her, "I have done it to prove how much I love you," or something like that. She did still not know what had really happened. A statement said to have been made by Kennedy said he went to the house after deciding to take money belonging to Mr. Rolfe. Mr. Rolfe became restless and he hit him with the 10-pin bowling skittle to knock him out. Mr. Rolfe continued to wake up and he hit him again on the head and he started to panic then. Kennedy's statement said he thought it would make it look like Mr. Rolfe had been robbed outside his front door. He started to get him dressed, but it was then he realised he was not breathing. After taking the body to the lay-by, he returned to the house, collected the bedclothes and burnt them. I didn't mean to kill him. That's all there was to it, and I didn't mean it to do it like that. Mr. Everett said that when charged, Mrs. Rolfe said, "I never touched him, honest on my baby's life." Professor Francis Camps, pathologist, was asked by Mr. Everett if it was easy or difficult to dress a dead body. He replied, "In my experience, it is a very difficult thing to do." Asked if it would be easier for one person or 2 to get the clothes onto a dead body, he said, "I think there was no question if it was easier if you got someone to help." Professor Camp said he thought there'd been at least 3 blows to Mr. Rolfe's head, but probably 4. Describing the wounds, he declared, "It is crushed, that skull, almost like an eggshell." Miss Christine Ann Foster, also of Basildon, said John Kennedy had been lodging at her house. She said she was a particular friend of Miss Rolfe and regularly visited her home. Asked by Mr. Everett about the autumn of last year when Mrs. Rolfe said she was expecting a baby, Miss Foster said that Mrs. Rolfe told her Brian would not see the baby.